Okay, here we go. The Little Devil. Now, of course, in prepping this piece, this originally was done as there was a pencil drawing, and it was a pretty rendered pencil drawing for me, more than just a sketch of this guy that was included in a sketchbook that we did a few years ago. And so I took that drawing, scanned it in, and took it into Photoshop and just added more or less value to the background, just so that I didn't have a white, the sketch, was just pencil on a white background. So this added some value to it. I turned that to my usual sepia background, and then printed that out on archival paper and mounted it down using matte medium to 1/4 inch masonite. So that's basically how we got to the starting point on this. And you can see a little on the right hand side of the underpainting. There's a darker kind of patch on the edge. That's sometimes the print will have a little bit of a white edge when I crop the thing or something like that showed up. So that's just done that's done in acrylic, and it's just an additional little cleanup before I really get into laying down any oil. The other thing that I did with this piece before I got started working on the final color lay-in was I did do a few color comps in Photoshop. I really, having looked at the pencil drawing and really designed this piece as a pencil drawing, I had, a few different things in mind for color. I always like the idea of using like a gray as a background. I think it lets the color of the objects really pop out. So that was something I wanted to play around with. I also did kind of more of a Garden of Eden-y background that was based on some palettes and things, even from some Renaissance paintings that I had looked at. Ultimately decided that was too cheery for a painting of what is, the little devil here. So I decided to go with more of your basic brimstone and fire palette, which is, the reddish fire and the orange and reddish colors that I got here. So, once I decided that, now I'm just starting to lay in this background. And really, in the first pass of this, as always, it's just a matter of trying to cover the underpainting. Cover any of the acrylic, patching that may have been done, any of the covering, pretty much all of the digital underpainting that's there. You can see here where the value of the oil is taken even further than what the value of the underpainting was. It was, a little too light, but that's fine. Really what I was looking for in that underpainting, other than transferring the drawing, was just not to be painting on a white background. I do like having a little bit of tone to start with. So the first pass on this background, again, to get back to that, it's not something I'm always even looking for total opacity on. I'm just trying to lay the colors in, make sure everything's working. Even from the color comp to the final piece, there's some subtle colored variations that'll happen. It's not exactly like the color sketch. So I just want to, make sure everything in there is going according to plan and that kind of thing. So, a lot of times I will come back and do a light glaze over the background again. So I'm not even really worried about blending that down too much or any of that kind of thing at this point. Just covering the underpainting. So I thought about how I was going to approach this guy, seeing as he's pretty much a black sort of snake. Now, I have him represented as what would be an Amphithere, which is essentially, a snake-like body with some wings. So my idea was I was going to basically reproduce the pencil drawing, for lack of a better term, with this dark paint, and then start, once that was dry, with glazes of what probably would be like a dark Payne's gray or something. And we'll get that, we'll get there here in a minute. Again, at this point, I'm still just trying to lay in some of these things like the trees, getting some real value and some color in there. You can see how much darker the dark that I'm using is than what was on the underpainting. So it's nice to really see that develop a little more. And these darks are nowhere near black, so there's still quite a bit of a way to go. Now, different from my usual approach where I'll lay in the whole, like just try and cover the underpainting and lay in the whole thing and then sort of develop up the detail towards the end of the piece. This time I was kind of going into it with a decent amount of the detail being done at this stage, especially in the figure or the dragon himself. And again, trying to cover the background, the underpainting in the background. And at this point, I was moving pretty quickly, but the lay-in for the background, as rough as it is still wet. So it gives me an opportunity to work some of these edges on certain things. Now, again, as we get down in here to the wings, I'm starting to just sort of reproduce the pencil drawing. But I also knew that the upper neck and sort of the back of the back was really going to be my focal area on this guy. And I've talked about having like little focal areas within the piece before, so, my idea here and my thought pattern is that as the dragon goes down to the lower portion of the composition, the detail on all the little scales and stuff like that will fall out and also get a little darker. The value structure will bracket down a little bit. So as I'm laying the wings in, I'm thinking about that because I'm trying to create a sort of a transition as the piece gets to the lower section of the figure. As I work around this back shoulder too, there is some areas where as it falls away here, I knew I was going to have to resolve a little bit further some of the drawing that was going on in some of the scales and, the things that were going down his back. So it's an opportunity to kind of work on that as well. But to me, it's kind of an interest. Now, I am using a few colors. I want to say this. I am using some colors and some middle tones on the tree. But the dragon himself, I'm really just sticking to that dark color and working the darks through it. So it's really more of a drawing with oil paint than kind of what I would consider like a typical, more of a, like an alla prima lay-in where you're trying to cover everything in one sitting. And again, now, I believe that still, most of this background is still pretty wet. So even though it's a little choppy and I'm not really blending it down, I am trying to get in there and cover all the negative spaces. There'll be sort of another opportunity to get in here with this background and make it as smooth as I want it to be with the sort of smoky clouds that are represented in the background. I'm not actually showing any flame or thing like that. It's just an indication of the fire, with the orange color. So it's just a little bit of like a smoke texture, I would describe it as. And as always, I'm flipping these things constantly. With this guy, he had such a cylindrical form to follow that it was almost a repeat to work on it upside down as it was to work the piece acclimated right side up. It was like a big S shape that it was. So there was kind of what felt like some continuity in the way I had started to learn how the scales fell on this body doing this thing. So by flipping it just acclimates it that way, and it gives me there's a little bit of like a muscle retention almost in the way I start to draw the scales because of that. So I constantly flip things around. I've talked about this before, but just for that brush acclimation the direction that your hand gets into, especially doing little patterns and scales and things, it can be helpful to try and take advantage of that. And the palette looks pretty red, and it is. I think there's like a a Mars Violet in there or something like that, and probably Terra Rosa in those middle to darker tones, but there's still a lot of room to push this more towards a chromatic red, which we'll see when we finally get around to laying the apple in, or even laying a glaze into that apple. But again, you know, this process of kind of drawing over the pencil drawing, it can be a little more tedious at the beginning than, again, my normal approach, where I'm not trying to stick so tightly to a drawing that I already have. And usually, again, I'm trying to put the detail in at the end. I'm saving that for the end. This time, it was just a different approach. I had the detail pretty well figured out from the graphite, so I just didn't want to lose that. It was worth taking a little bit of the extra time to not blow that out at this stage. And you'll see that once I get through, I don't want to call it outlining, but going in there and really, pushing the linear aspects of the scale patterns and stuff, it becomes easier to deal with the dragon, just to figure out the value that he's going to represent in this piece by using glazes. So, and there you can see, the apple now with, I believe that's just an alizarin crimson glaze over it, really puts it in the piece. It's still pretty flat, rendering wise. It doesn't have, anywhere near the finishing touches that it'll get, but we can kind of see it represented in space and in the right value in this thing. So it's just a matter from that point of working the detail out. And of course, the other thing I should say, just to reiterate, is that I'm something like that alizarin crimson glaze that I put over the apple is has a lot of liquid in it, so it's set up to be dry the next time I work over that. Okay, now here we go, and you can tell everything's dry. Sometimes it dries kind of flat, which you can see as it gets layered in. And here's an example, like I'm just going over this thing with just clear liquid the next day. So everything's dry, and this gives me just sort of a wet surface over the entire painting. It also ensures that anything I paint into this is going to be affected by this medium. And it also brings out all these darks and stuff too. It brings those sunken areas out, so you really see what value you're dealing with here. And I knew with painting something that was, represented as black. He's a black snake, although very rarely does a black object get painted with a heavy amount of black. It just, usually there are other colors involved. I mean, it may have some black in it. Some artists do choose to go that way, but so I knew I was going to be sort of splitting hairs with the black colors and things like that. And so I thought this would give me a little more control. Now here you can see, I believe this is just a Payne's gray, and it looks pretty, that's sort of my go-to black a lot of times, but it's really more of a real navy, a neutral navy blue almost. But this just, again, now we're at a point where more like my usual approach, I'm really just trying to cover everything down. But the time that I took to get all those scales and stuff in there in that dark tone is gonna pay off through the rendering of this thing, and you'll see how that develops here. So I've got that all in, and now I'm just kind of dusting that stuff down, because this Payne's gray is going to be the foundation for pretty much everything that happens here. And of course, I have my reference, probably a copy of the sketch and a copy of the color sketch off screen here, off camera, which I'm looking at all the time. One of the things I did decide to do was to give him a little white belly. It was going to be just about this, and a little bit of red I figured were going to be about all I needed to give me the natural pattern that I wanted to lend to this character. So even though this looks like white, I doubt this is white. I'm sure this is a warm, a gray of some kind. But again, just kind of noodling this kind of stuff in. This doesn't occur very much in the piece. So right away, it already starts to look like, you're almost getting a full color read already. So I figured this was important to get in kind of early on because it would give me a lot of information about where and how to move forward. And as I mentioned before, I always see the devil with like red eyes, but I also wanted to incorporate sort of a red pattern on him, a little diamond pattern or something down the scales. Not exactly a stripe, but it sort of is a stripe. So I was able to just, to get into that a little more, I was able to lay that in here and kind of figure out what little plates it was going to affect and things like that. And again, I'm able to figure that out more definitively at this stage because I have that real tight underdrawing underneath it. I may be talking myself into doing a tight underdrawing all the time as I go through this. There is an advantage to it. And with something like this little guy where it's a fairly simple composition, I don't have a lot of background elements and stuff like that to deal with. It really is the rendering. It's an interesting path to take in getting this guy. I mean, you could certainly lay this all in dark, just lay it in the form and then work the scales later and do that. And you would probably wind up with something, that was just as good, but it would be different. So it's just another take on how to approach something like this. But to me, I find that it really helped me control the process and also give me I was pretty happy with the drawing, as I mentioned. So I really didn't want to deviate from that a whole lot. So, and that it helped me do that as well. And now, even just looking at the body right there, and the grays are still pretty light, but you can see where, he already looks, everything kind of reads as it should read. He reads as a black, although kind of a grayish black. And we're going to beat that down into submission here. But the red is reading well, and I can see which, little scales to render a certain way and that kind of a thing. So now that I'm getting into the form of this, I'm really getting into the values that, to me, I wouldn't represent as much in something like a graphite rendering. This is a value that's just a few steps off the dark that was in there already. And, it's about taking this thing all the way to a fully realized rendering from the pencil drawing. And then here's even another, this was almost a reflected light that I started to kind of see just as I was working this thing. But I wanted to, it was just a way to incorporate just yet another little bit of a color. And this is more of a grayish brown as opposed to the blue. And you can see, and you can really see it more in the original. It's tough to capture all these subtleties in video and in print, but it was one of those things that I knew with the element being so singular as he is here, other than the apple, that I didn't want him to look like just a dull string of black. I really wanted to have him be full color. So that's what all of my thinking is in just pushing the palette a little warmer, some areas a little cooler in some areas. I still want everything to kind of read as pretty much as a black, but black with some color in it, even though they're very neutral colors. And the fact that one's warm and one's cool, that you see the value of those colors. And I don't mean the value in the dark and the light, but you see the quality of the coolness or the warmth of the color because there's the variations in there. If it was all cool, you wouldn't notice it as much. But because it's a warm against a cool, you start to see those differences develop a little more. Now, as I get down to this lower portion, one of my concerns was that, I had all this drawing in the scale, but I definitely wanted to lessen the detail just a little bit, soften it a little bit, as I was talking about earlier, because it's going to fall behind the apple. So it's one of the things I was considering about the lower portion. obviously up there, you know, and behind the shoulders and stuff like that. That's where I really want the most detail. And I think that might be a filbert, but I'm also in here with a lot of little rounds at this point. This piece, like many of these, the Dragons in Nature series, this was a 8.5 by 11-inch oil painting, so it's not an enormous piece. And at this point too, you know, there's very little real black in this also. You know, some of the darker colors, again, I've used, you know, at this point, the dioxazine purple, I believe is one I use a lot, and I mix that with Payne's gray sometimes. Also, I use phthalo blue and alizarin crimson, along with combinations of burnt umber. All of those colors mixed together, or variations of those, say 4 colors, are usually what I go to for my blacks. They're all kind of transparent, dark colors. You know, some are red, some are blue, some are violet. And sometimes I even mix some of them together to cancel each other out if they're too chromatic. But they're all fairly transparent and give you a good dark, while still, you know, keeping some chroma to the color, to the paint you're using. And now, you know, this is the stage here where it begins. We start pecking around, and it is just kind of putting in the time and the detail. Now, the one thing I guess I haven't made what I'd call the second pass on really are these wings, which we start to get into here now. And the wings, you know, again, they're something that I want to control the amount of detail that's in them. And by that, I don't want them to be as busy as the scale pattern. So I start to bracket the values on the wings a little bit, and then you'll see where I just push in a couple of highlights, just enough to give it some form. But I really was looking for the wings to represent that kind of, you know, the sort of bat wing silhouette that we associate with dragons and things like that so often. And again, you know, throughout the wing. Now, once I got through the main section of this guy, I, you know, pretty much had the palette figured out. So the wings also have, you know, that some cool areas and some warm areas. And even though I did kind of start to mix them up a little bit after a while, I sort of played it like the cool areas were the planes that were on the top of this guy, and the warm areas then were the planes on the bottom, almost as though you were doing like an old 70s rendition of Chrome, where you had the blue on the top and the earth on the bottom. Of course, this doesn't have that kind of reflective quality, but it was that same sort of theory that I was kind of implementing with the color. So talking about that detail a little bit, you know, one way to keep some of that detail down is by using some larger brushes. So you did see I went in there with some larger flats on that wing, just to give some of those big areas a little more of a, what I'll call an artistic brush stroke in there. Now, sometimes those artistic brush strokes make it to the end of the painting and sometimes they don't. So, you know, we'll see how that one goes. So again, you know, you can see here, starting to work around the edge of the wing, getting it in some detail. As I work on the edge of the wing itself, the edge where it goes to the, you know, where it transitions to the background, one thing that was going through my head on this, because the background was so simple, I figured I would more or less render the figure first at this point, get him more or less done, and then go back to the clouded area, the smoke or mist in the background, and kind of deal with it at the end. And one of the things that allows me to do is that if I do make a little drawing change to the silhouette of the dragon at this point, you know, it still gives me one more shot to go over that background and clean all that up. And then again, you know, again on this side, this is more or less a repeat of the other the other wing, you can see a little more of the anatomy. I think the anatomy is explained a little more obviously on this wing that's forward. You see sort of a shoulder muscle and that kind of thing. But as far as the palette goes, I was trying to keep the blue towards the top side and the warmer sort of brown gray towards the bottom, and try and get the form in without it looking too busy. Of course, he's has a leathery little texture to it, so it's a little bit of push and pull. A lot of times wings for me, it's a matter of laying them in and then blending some of that down, seeing what starts to emerge and look like form, and then playing that up. And of course, if it doesn't go well, you get rid of it. So, but really one of the things here, and you can see here with the larger brush, is that I was a little concerned about it, again, being too detail-y and being something that competed with the body of the little guy rather than complementing it. So the bigger brushes help with that, and then just peck in there with a few of the smaller brushes, which many times for me are filberts or small rounds. And I'm still looking at the sketch and all that kind of thing, trying to represent that. But at this point, we're definitely, we have more value down on this thing than I had or would ever have in a pencil drawing. So there's just a few more gaps to fill in, basically. But at this point, just about everything, all those initial glazes and all that kind of stuff, all that's really starting to homogenize a little bit into this final rendering. I don't see any of the underpainting. I don't see any of the wash really that was there at that certain point. So all of that really developed pretty nicely, and that method I think worked pretty well for this piece. Now the head, of course, was the opposite than the wings. The head, other than that little bit right below it, is really where we want the biggest punch. So, of course, the first thing is here to get in here, cover the wash, cover all that stuff, and just get some wet paint that I can push around. But I think one of the things that was going through my mind, and it happens a lot when I have a sketch or a like some kind of a preliminary piece that I'm really happy with, is that really my job here at this point is just not to screw this thing up. I was happy with the head and the expression he had and all that kind of thing in the preliminary work. So I really just wanted to bring that value now and everything that I had learned from rendering the rest of this body into this head and just get it into being full value. I didn't really want to change anything about the drawing. There's a little bit around the way the red scales, the way they fall, that needs to be dealt with a little bit. But again, it was just playing in this cool gray and the warm gray. Now you can see there, just starting to peck around the darks coming down the back of that neck, how it starts to define some of where those red scales were laid in, but they're kind of ambiguous as to where they start and finish. We're starting to kind of work that out a little bit more here. And they're just pecking in a lot of small detail. One of the areas that I was just, I don't want to say it gave me trouble, but it was something that I had on my mind through the whole piece, is just the way that spine turns around there under his jaw there. And I didn't want it, that was an area that I felt like over rendering it could make the drawing look wrong. Under rendering it could, also make the drawing look wrong. So that was a real, walking a tightrope there. You can see I sort of hesitantly put in a couple of little ping highlights and stuff like that, but they get a little more confident as we move on here. Also, the little, the small details, obviously, I have a little bit of that red palette there, but those little little dots of detail that kind of give the edge of the plate scaling just a little ridge or something like that. You know, that's always neat little detail to add, and can also really help enforce the direction that the scales are going. Because you know, as you look at them, some of the scales are they're not all exactly the same shape, which was done deliberately, but the highlight would fall down it in a little bit more of a consistent way. So by adding those little ping highlights, I'll call them, in kind of a consistent row down the scales, it really gives it the appearance that the form is consistent. And now again here with the background, you can kind of see that it's kind of laid in, and I haven't really addressed the trees or anything yet either. But at this point now, we've got most of the upper body and by upper body I mean the wings, the upper part, and the head of the little devil himself in there. So now we're down to this lower part, which again was an area, and I mentioned this earlier, that I knew I definitely didn't want the detail that I have in that neck. You know, there's a big shadow, and I like to, you know, when there's something like that and I can soften the edge on that's further away, it's sort of something that, again, Frazetta used to do quite a bit. You know, his shadows almost always went to a solid, like no information in them. It was all one big value. And that can be so effective to create a real strong form on something. You know, and for this, you know, I needed that to kind of ground this bottom. So I also, you know, didn't want visually, I didn't want to have a huge amount of impact right down there around the base, where it's just sort of on the periphery of the painting itself. So I wanted it to kind of fade away, so to speak. So one way I did that was by keeping the value bracketed down on these scales. They're also a little looser. You know, they're just a little bit looser than the rest of the piece, so that it can kind of fade away. And you can see there too that from time to time I'll just pick up a slightly larger brush, and that gives me also, it automatically kind of, you know, makes me fight for detail. And I also have I've mentioned this before too, but when a filbert goes to die in my studio, it usually means it can't hold a point anymore. But I'm pretty good with keeping those brushes clean, so they're still soft. They're just they just won't hold a point. You know, they're frayed. So I use those as little mini dusters, which you'll see me use from time to time. It'll look like there's no paint on the brush at all, and basically all I'm in there doing with those kind of things are I'm just in there softening the edges. So now, of course, there we got our red pattern in. And you can see what I mean on that, how it kind of gets fuzzy towards the back, and it gets more out of focus as it starts to fall away. That gives it some depth, I think. And the apple, you know, I did get some reference for the apple. And, you know, that really starts to, brings it to life more than just this red ball. You know, there's always some subtlety in having a prop that it's hard for your mind to pick out all those little textures and the way a light might hit something. You can really see it across the top here. You know, once I lit the thing, it showed me some form that I just wasn't clicking in my mind when I drew it. But I didn't really need that initially. But now here that we're in the stage of trying to make this seem a little more realistic, I wanted something that was, you know, more complete with its value and all of the texture information that I needed. Just right there, laid in kind of rough, you know, it already looks more realistic than what I had before, which admittedly was just a lay-in, but you can see where some reference can go a long way. There were these little indications of green in it too, and a green, of course, against a red is, you know, that those complements together can really draw the eye. So while I did want to incorporate some green in there, it really is more in the form of kind of a warm brown. It looks like green when you see it in the apple itself, but on the palette, it's really not that green. But anyway, my point is that, again, like working in the different variations of color in the dragon, even though he was black, here we're working in different variations of red, even though, the apple is red, but there's some green in it, there's some dark brown in it. It's not just a string of red going from black to a tint of red, And I just think, I believe that when you see, a lot of the plein air painters that I've talked about too, they're kind of masters at pulling that kind of stuff out of what they see. But it adds a lot of reality to it. I toyed with the idea of having a bite taken out of the apple, but ultimately decided not to. I think because it was starting to make the apple too busy. I think that was my thinking at the time, but it was either the moment before or the moment after. And now there's some real darks in there, and I don't know if we show this or not, but I do go back in just slightly over the figure itself and touch in some of these real dark accents. I can kind of see them in the bottom. I don't know if we have that, but yeah. And again, like even just adding that little bit of that stem adds a bit of reality to it, a little bit of detail. And it also was going to be a color, the palette now that stem is, and this is kind of subtle, but it's a little warmer than, you can kind of see it there. It's a one more little texture and color that appear in this thing. But by establishing that stem there, that was going to be my palette now to finish the trees, which up until this point are just the lay-in still, as is much of the background there. So sometimes you back into some things like that with the palettes, where something will occur again. And in this case, it's that sort of woody texture. So, as I've mentioned before with this piece and all these little things, this is really a game of inches. I'm trying to add a little bit of detail to it so that it does feel like this intimate close-up of this little guy. But at the same time, I want some of that detail to fall away as we get out to the periphery of the painting. And I certainly don't want any kind of detail or real shocky color that takes the attention away from the head, the head or the body that we've created at this point. All right, so there you go. The Little Devil. This was a fun little one to bring to finish. I'm glad I finally did. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it, and I appreciate you joining me. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. I just want to thank everyone for sticking around. If you're interested in joining the Patreon, we'll have links around for that. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you next time.